Hey everyone, welcome to the second day of programs for the Vancouver Art Book Fair. If you're just tuning in, I'm Vivian Sming, pronouns she, her, they, them, and I publish artist books through my publishing studio Sming Books, and am the guest curator for this year's virtual program. The Vancouver Art Book Fair is committed to the advancement, appreciation, and circulation of artist publishing. The fair and programs are free and open to the public, so please consider joining their membership. And here's Aladdin to say, sign up to help pay artist fees and keep these events free and accessible. We'll share the link in the chat to join. And before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that the Vancouver Art Book Fair takes place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm streaming here from my home in the Bay Area on the land stewarded by the Muwekma Ohlone people. And as we're here to talk about books and publishing, I also want to acknowledge the many histories and languages and knowledges that have been erased through the prioritization of paper as being the source of history, legitimacy, and value. So I do want to offer these programs as a way to understand how publishing and how books can be a site of resistance, restoration, contestation, and imagination. So thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to introduce Kameelah Janan Rasheed. In her practice, Kameelah grapples with the poetics, politics, and pleasures of the unfinished. She creates ecosystems of iterative and provisional projects. These projects include sprawling, architecturally scaled Xerox-based collages, large-scale public installations, publications, digital archives, lecture performances, library interventions, poems, poetic gestures, and other forms yet to be determined. So thank you, Kameelah. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you for everyone for coming. I'm going to share my screen. And if you have questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. I'll be looking. And I'm really excited to be here. So let me share my screen. All righty. Good to go? Can we see? Wonderful. So again, as Vivian already noted, I'm Kameelah Janan Rasheed, and I'm super excited to be here. I'm really grateful.
We can't see your screen, sorry.
Oh,
there you go, there you go. Oh, wait. It was just there.
Yep, no worries. I'll try again.
Cool, you're good.
We're good? Awesome. So yes, I wanted to also just extend a thank you to Vivian. We've been talking about books for like a couple of years now, so it's really exciting to be in conversation with her yet again about books. And I'll be talking about the poetics, politics, and pleasures of the unfinished. And I guess I'll just start with saying, I hope everyone is doing okay. This is a really strange time. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk about books because I do think that books and publishing and thinking about these things give me a sense of hope and imagining and optimism that I think is really hard found at this moment. So I'm really appreciative that you guys are having me today. So I like to always start off my presentations with giving clarity about who I am, and particularly in my practice. While I am an artist, I mostly identify as a learner. And for me, that means I'm constantly in the process of making sense of new information. And so I don't like to sit in a place of expertise or sit in a place of sort of being fixed. I like to think about myself as a person who's learning and trying to share my learning and learn alongside other people. And so there are a couple images here. On the left side is a picture of me, I think in 3rd grade. And was probably being super annoying because I was answering a question that no one asked. And then on the right side, you'll see an excerpt from the About the Author pages of some books I published at my school in Northern California, Bay Area. In East Palo Alto, we had a publishing center, which was basically this older woman who would sit in the trailer with a typewriter and a bunch of publishing materials. And I made it my goal to publish as many books as I could before I left 2nd grade. And so these are the 2 About Author pages from 2 of the books that my mom kept. And I'm really excited to think about now at 35, how a lot of these ideas around publishing, being able to sort of craft a narrative or to make sense of things started at a very young age, and seeing myself sort of grow through that is really exciting for me. So I like to always start presentations off with a little bit of context. So to literally build an ecosystem of like thoughts and thinkers and ideas that are helping me feel buoyant and feel that I can share in a way that has some level of coherency without closing myself off. And so, and thinking about some ideas that I've been thinking about, because I've been working on a lot of like artist statements and applications, and they're always like, please tell me what you do in the neatest statement possible. And I hate filling out applications. I'm like, what I do is sprawl and I'm ecological, so you really can't put in a category. And they're like, no, if you don't give us a category, you're not getting this grant. So while I don't like the process, one thing that it does help me do is it allows me to start building out this more clear ecosystem of ideas that are helping me make sense of my practice. And so I think about my practice as ecological. And for me, that means that I create these ecosystems of iterative and provisional projects, as Vivian has noted. And the reason why I started using this language of ecosystems is that it implied a sense of aliveness, a sense of movement, a sense of living, a sense of activity, a sense of like literal vibration that got me really excited, because it meant that in the process of making things, I could think not about what I'm making, but I could think about the quality or the context under which I'm making, which is a context of living. And so in thinking about a lot of these ideas, I returned to a theorist who's done a lot of work, Catherine McKittrick, who talks about these notions of Black Atlantic livingness, Christina Sharp, who talks about thinking and imagining laterally in multiple Black everydays. I think about Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who talks about the text being alive. I think about Fred Moten, who talks about notions of openness and refusals to coalesce or resist enclosure. And I keep coming back to a lot of notions that Alexis Pauline Gumbs talks about around ancestrally co-written texts. And so in my practice, I'm really trying to think about how do I build this dense ecosystem between people and organisms and processes? How do I build what Octavia Butler calls a primitive hypertext? How do I actually build this thing, which is sort of a pointing at many things and sort of this motion of drifting between many ideas and processes and genres? And so in thinking about a lot of this, I feel like a lot of my ideas come out of like editing a Google document and saving snapshots of like those edits, or having a conversation with a friend where they say something as simple as "I'm not dead." And the reason why I'm putting these two things up is I think that at a moment of accelerated death, at a moment of accelerated premature death, unrecognized death, it's important for me to think about livingness. It's important for me to think about how I imagine publication as a way to say that we get to extend ourselves, we get to be alive, we get to find ways to be alive, and to write about those people who are living with us and people who have passed in this context, in this form, but are still with us. And so that has meant a shift in my language from Black lived experience to something as simple as Black living experience. That small change, reminding ourselves of a positioning of futurity. So in thinking about this livingness and this sprawl, and thinking about ideas of containers and thinking about ideas of organizing, because I think a lot of times when we think about organizing, it's about putting things into neat containers where they can sit and be in a controlled context. I always come back to this letter that Emily Dickinson wrote to Thomas Higginson, who is one of the editors at The Atlantic at the time, where he's giving her feedback on her writing. And if you know a little bit about Emily Dickinson's writing, you know that she kind of does whatever she wants. And because of that, that leads to like differences in grammatical structures and punctuations, verbs become nouns. But she sort of writes this note back, and myself, along with theorists who are much more versed in Emily Dickinson's life, have seen this as a bit of trolling. So she writes to him, "Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you called me wayward. Will you help me improve?" And I'm sitting here thinking, and I kind of think we all know, given the course of Emily Dickinson's work, that she had no interest in improving. But I'm really interested in this passage because of these notions around organizing, these notions around having a monarch that rules and gives orders, these notions around any attempt to organize this livingness into these nice packages, literally as explosion, right? And I'm really interested in this idea of improvement as being part of like a larger capitalist narrative around progress and self-improvement, which is she's sort of like, yes, please help me improve. Let me be a more productive, orderly person. And so I'm thinking about Emily Dickinson and some other folks that I'll mention. What does it mean to be complete? What does it mean to be organized? What does it mean to sort of fit into a neat package? And so there are a lot of things, and it looks like this little guy got here and he wasn't supposed to be there. There are a lot of things that I've been thinking about with regard to this notion of like being charred or explosion. And it makes me think a lot about leakiness. And for me, when I think about leakiness, I think about like a literal container where things are escaping. Like it doesn't want to be in the container in this process of refusing the enclosure. And so when I think about leakiness, I think about the refusal of enclosure. I think about this desire for aliveness. And I think about leaking as like a physical process, but also as sort of a conceptual process of leaking across genres, leaking across disciplines, leaking across species, leaking across, moving back and forth. And a lot of this has to do with this notion of refusing the grasp or refusing the container. And so for one of the classes that I'm currently teaching, the main class I'm currently teaching, I keep coming back to this essay in the April 2020 edition of eFlux magazine, Traces, Signs, and Symptoms of the Untranslatable by Maria Clavo, because she talks about glissant and talks about notions of Western knowledge. And she goes back to the etymology of the word comprehend to remind us that the idea of comprehend, prende, means to grab a hold of or to grasp. And this sort of Western colonial desire, as she talks about, to grasp, to hold on to something, to fix things. And in my practice, being very interested in the unfixing of things and sort of what exceeds the page, what exceeds the sentence, what exceeds interpretation. And when I ask these questions around what exceeds the page, what exceeds the sentence, what exceeds interpretation, I'm immediately taken to Zora Neale Hurston, who in her 1935 text, Mules and Men, talks about this notion of Black evasiveness as a way to sort of escape or refuse to grasp. And she writes, and the Negro, in spite of his open-faced laughter, his seeming acquiescence, is particularly evasive. You see, we are polite people, and we do not say to our questioner, get out of here. We smile when we tell him or her something that satisfies the white person, because knowing so little about us, he doesn't know what he is missing. The Indian resists curiosity by stony silence. The Negro offers a feather-bed resistance. That is, we let the probe enter, but it never comes out. It gets smothered under a lot of laughter and pleasantries. The theory behind our tactics: the white man is always trying to get into somebody's business. All right, I'll set something outside the door of my mind for him to play with and handle. He can read my writing, but he sure can't read my mind. I'll put this play toy in his hand and he will seize it and go away. Then I will say my say and sing my song. And this is one of my favorite excerpts because there's like this interesting thing that happens for me when I think about intertextuality and text. And I have this like magical world in my head where I'm like, Maria Clavo was writing directly to Zora Neale Hurston, and Zora Neale Hurston is talking directly to Ralph Ellison, and then Ralph Ellison sent a tweet to someone else. In my mind, there's this large ecosystem that's happening. And for me, it's important to think about writing in that way and publication in that way, because it reminds us that the texts that precede or are published at the same time or come after one another are all in conversation with one another, whether it's intentional or not. And as future readers and as present readers, it becomes this beautiful opportunity to think about those linkages. And so as much as I love building these ecosystems and trying to map everything and seeing the relation of everything and making everything clear and being like Zora Neale Hurston to this and to that, the one thing that I'm often sort of like brought back to earth around is around these notions of completion and just the viability of these tasks. And so I want to offer a couple of things that are helping me think about this. At the very bottom, you'll see this excerpt from Wikipedia, which, as you all know, is the world's most well-known free digital encyclopedia. It is the Encarta of us 90s babies and 80s babies years. Wikipedia is the thing. But Wikipedia also recognizes its inability to be complete or finite. And for their dynamic list, they have this little note that says, this is a dynamic list and may never be able to satisfy particular standards for completeness, which always reminds me of this sort of like poetic moment of them being like, yeah, we can't It's impossible. There's also this reminder about the observable universe, which is basically what we can perceive given the pace at which light travels, and what we can actually perceive is so limited in comparison to the entire size of the universe. So what does it mean when we say something is complete? What does it mean when we say we know something with certainty? What does it mean when we're asserting something with such extreme confidence when our presence on this earth is literally a speck, and within that we don't even have the perceptual capacities to make sense of everything? And the last note that I want to offer around these notions of completeness and sort of like the nature of things being persistently unfinished is this excerpt from the 18th chapter of the Quran, which Muslims are encouraged to read every Friday. There's a story between Musa or Moses and Khadir where they're going on this journey. Musa's asking lots of questions. Khadir's like, chill out, just go on the journey. Musa can't really go on the journey. So Khadir's like, we're going to part ways. And as this chapter ends, there's this one note that always sticks with me. And it says, if the sea were ink for writing the words of my Lord, the sea would be exhausted before the words of my Lord were exhausted, even if we brought the like of it as a supplement. And for me, that just means as soon as we think we have comprehended something or have gathered all the notes or read everything, as soon as we think at that exact moment that we have that confidence, we actually are moved into a place of complete uncertainty. And so with that in mind, referring to my favorite show, The X-Files, there are always like wonderful screen caps that I like. This is, oh no, this is, I don't know what's happening. Okay, I'm sorry. That was very bizarre. I'm so sorry. Nope, what is happening? There we go. I'm so sorry, everyone. So with that being said, from one of my favorite television shows, The X-Files, there's always amazing screen captures that are referencing these moments of just non-comprehension. This one being a conversation where he acknowledges there are limits to my knowledge. And this other moment when they're studying cockroaches and their exoskeleton, and they reach a point in their research where they recognize things beyond comprehension. And so in thinking about all this, what does this have to do with publication? I want to think about publication as an opportunity to sort of think about what exceeds the page, what exceeds the text, and what exceeds the plot. And so for a project that I was doing this summer with the Public Art Foundation, Public Art Fund, excuse me, I had made a work called A Plot Twist. And I thought about a plot or plot twist in a couple of ways. I said that a plot twist could be an offering, an opening. And while stumbling through Christina Sharp's monstrous intimacies, making post-slavery subjects, I stumbled across an epigraph of Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, where she referenced Derek Walcott's 6 fictions. And it says, pray for a life without plot, a day without narrative. And this notion of being, as she notes, to be without the story of captivity, to be without a plot, to be without a particular sort of play out of life. And so I'm thinking about books and thinking about publication, what I keep holding on to is this notion that no publication is ever finished, that through publication, we can think about being outside of the notion of plot, being outside of the notion of a finished page. And above this is an excerpt from a piece of work that I've created that talks about this vibrating page. And me just thinking about this image of a vibrating page, literally words can't settle on it. And so for me, this notion of an unfinished text is a text or a publication that is constantly living on a vibrating page, a page that won't settle itself, so the words themselves can't settle. And so this summer, when I was speaking with Vivian, I was sending notes back and forth about something, not even related to Vancouver, our book fair, and I was talking about what I thought about what publication was and is. And one of the things that kept coming up for me was sort of my frustration or fear around publishing things. This idea of finality, this idea that the thing exists and can't be changed, right? And so thinking about, for me, the way in which I think about publication, not as a process of sharing a final and unalterable object into the world, but rather a practice of offering a substrate for emendation, for revision, for call and response, for iteration. So when we offer something into the world as a publication, we're offering it with the understanding that it will be changed either through our later revisions or through the revisions that other people add through paratext, through annotation, through crumbling, through just complete changing through commentary, through response. And so thinking about these texts as being in an intertextual relationship, thinking about them being leaky and that things come out of them and things come in their porosity, but thinking about text as part of a living relationship. And this is why I get so excited when I read something that reminds me of something else, because it reminds me that these books are having these secret conversations with one another. And every so often we get to listen in just a little bit to see what those are. And so with that being said, I was telling students a few days ago, I was like, I actually don't like talking about my work. So I usually will talk about other people's work and ideas before I get to my own, but I'll only do that for like 1 more minute and then I'll actually talk about things that I've done. One of the texts that I was teaching this semester was Pope L's Proto-Skin set. And the interview in the beginning is like absolutely fascinating. My mom bought this book for me for my birthday and it's absolutely fascinating of an interview. And there are a couple of things that are really interesting for me. He talks about the idea of a series versus a set and thinks about like, this is a set, not a series. Series implies doing a thing and then going on to something else. Set implies relationality. But he also talks about, he says that it is a dynamic open set where shit happens over time. And that's how he defines his work, right? This notion of like, I'm not closing this off. It's just like an open process and just shit is happening over time, right? And there's something very beautiful about this leaky notion of how he's working. And he also talks about notation where each of his works are connected and that they're constantly being a notation toward a larger sketch, which I also think is a beautiful idea, that your commentary, your annotations, them within themselves are just annotations and notations for something else. There's this constant sort of feeding on one another. And then finally, he talks about this notion of a written language. And he says, and I want to read this, for example, I always use a substrate or background surface when making a skin set. What if I did not? Written language requires a surface to be accessible, legible. What if the space of writing could be made up of many, many surfaces constantly in flux? What would writing look like in a space like this? And the activity of reading, how would it be accomplished? And so where I see some similarities in what he's saying, what I'm saying is thinking about what does it mean to write something that we know will change? And what does it mean as a reader to read something that we know that the person who wrote or published has intentions of changing or is not fixed? It sort of throws the notion of writer and reader into flux and sort of merges those roles a bit. And so as I'm wrapping up this section on context, I wanted to mention something I came across by accident, which are the difference between telic and atelic verbs. Telic verbs being verbs that have an intended end, and atelic verbs being verbs that have no clear goal or endpoint in their semantic structure. And being really excited about thinking about publishing, being in the context conceptually or literally of atelic actions that don't have a clear endpoint or a clear, like it's done, but to publish is to be in a constant process, but to publish is not to finish a thing and move on. I'm gonna actually skip this slide because I think we covered a lot of that. And just tell you a little bit about my friend Olipos, the Olipo group, a group of mathematicians and writers in the 60s. They're French and they did a lot of stuff around thinking about what they say here, the hidden resources of a sentence, which often meant imagining sentences as a bit leaky and imagining sentences as having a lot of space to invite new meaning over time. So we're gonna talk about my work now. We're only 20 minutes in and I'm talking about my work. We got there. So I wanna start here because there was a point where someone was like, does your family influence your work? And I was like, yeah, because I think about my family when I make my work, so I don't get the question. And someone's like, no, does like the actual physical manifestation of your work have anything to do with your family? I was like, no, I don't get what you're getting at. And I hadn't realized that I had shown this slide before I had shown slides of a book that I published in 2019. And so this is an image that represents, that doesn't represent, but is my, they're my father's notes when he converted to Islam in the early 1980s. As his process of learning, he would cut out different pages of books, type across things, annotate in the margins, and sort of this was his learning process. This process of revising, adding notes, annotating, this sort of multi-layered set of like texts that were pre-written, being written, and constantly being returned to. And thinking about that, when I found this notebook several years ago, I was really excited because I was like, oh, I kind of like the way that my dad takes notes. because I think it sort of shows the sort of how time has sort of changed and elapsed. But it also made me think about how so much of what we do in everyday life is engaged in a process of publishing, of writing, of making a thing that is meant to be distributed and shared. And so with that being said, I'm always reminded of Octavia Butler and Olamina and Parable Sower, who is in the process of writing her own holy text, and sort of this process of thinking through how we sort of work against structures that say a text, particularly holy text or final, or any other canonical text is final. How do we actually work against that? All righty. So we're going to look at some work now. I'm going to start with this book, No New Theories. And I'll start with the first story, which is that in the summer of 2018, this book was published. And I remember it was like a long summer. So many things were happening. And I remember this book got published and I was like super hyped about it. I was like, everyone buy my book. And I went to Print and Matter to pick up my book and I opened it. A few days later, I was like, there's like a weird typo here. And I was like, maybe that's just one thing. And I kept flipping and I was like, that doesn't look right. And by the time I had finished my process, I realized that the printers had made a mistake. And I remember flipping out and messaging Keith, who I was working with at the time, like, you have to pull the books off the shelf, burn them all. And he's like, first of all, we don't burn books. We can remove them. And it was just like a very depressing moment for me. So I was like, I put this book out into the world. There's an error. Like, what are we going to do? And I'm actually going to show you. This is the public, this is the copy from 2018. It's a little bit hard to see, but it exists. It's much smaller.
Hang on, sorry, Kameelah, not to interrupt you, but I think folks can only see your screen. So if you can just hang on 1 second and we'll get you on screen so you can yeah, show that again.
Oh, they can only see my screen, but not me. Got it. It's okay.
You're good now.
Okay. Also, this is the book that came out in 2018. And I will specifically show you the area that made me cry. This is the interview area. And so in early 2019, Print and Matter contacted me to say they had some funding and that we could go back to the book. And my first impulse was, you know what, all we're gonna do is just go back and fix all the errors and make the book error-free. That was my first impulse. And then as the year went on, I was like, well, what, can I just make a new book? Like, what does it mean to actually have a book out in circulation, to take it off the shelves and have people still have the old book and then put out another book with the same exact title and acknowledge that this is the same book that you published in 2018 that is now being published in 2019 that is new. And so that's what I did. And for me, I think it's important to note that oftentimes the concepts around like the unfinished, and things being constantly in flux are very, very sexy as concepts. When they actually happen to you in real life, they become less sexy because you actually feel the emotional toll of expectations that things are complete and final and your sense that you didn't live up to that. And so I want to show you guys the specific sections in the book where I actually made these very clear notes around sort of the unfinished, the idea that I will keep coming back to this. That's my mommy. So in the interview section, you have the original text that's written out. And then on top of that, you have annotations. And these annotations are coming from things that I had wanted to add later, notes that I was taking on the text as I was going back through. Some of the footnotes are the comments from letters that were sent back to me from my friend Jessica Lynn, with whom I was interviewing. And what's important, I think, about this is thinking about a publication as something that doesn't have to be done at the point of publication, but can have multiple iterations. So with this interview now, I'm in a third round of revisions, which I'm then going to publish as a third round of revisions. And so sort of thinking about revision and returning to the scene of presumed certainty as almost a ritual around which we sort of go back and say, what have we actually learned across a year? What have we learned across the week? And how do I make that accretive learning visible in the text that I'm presenting to the world? And so this was a very exciting venture for me because it allowed for me to sort of think about, what am I saying about learning? What am I saying about public learning? And what am I saying about my expectations of text? If I'm willing to talk about what I consider to be a mistake, but was able to actually start thinking about as an opportunity to not grow into the anxiety of the book is finished, I have to have said everything that I have to say. A book doesn't have to be a period, it can be a comma, it can be a colon, it can be a dash, it can be leading into something else. And so these are just a few more pages in the text. So that being said, when I think about publications, I work on and off the page when it comes to text and the notions of publication. And I had a show at Print and Matter in 2017. And Max Schulman talked to me about on a phone call recently. He said that he felt like that exhibit was walking into a book that exploded onto the walls, and then the book that I published was walking into an installation that was made into a book. And I kind of like both comparisons because I think that it reminds me of sort of how I'm trying to move between the architecture of a book and the architecture of a physical building to think about how I can take advantage of a fold, a crease, different elements of a space. So this is for a show called Each Sentence. This is for a project called Each Sentence is a Sponge at Mass MoCA. It went up in March, but didn't open to the public until July, and it'll be up through October 2021. And in an interview, I was asked about the title, and I explained what I think about sentences, which is that a sentence over time can absorb multiple meanings. And I'm really interested in thinking about what would happen if you were to wring out a sponge to see what else comes out. What does it mean to think about all the resonances and associations and permutations of a sentence? And so in this show, I worked a lot with ideas around translation and sort of the circle as this signification of something that's complete or a cycle, and thinking about that repetition throughout the work, in addition to how I can make use of the architecture and physics of the space to sort of think about a fold in a book or the spine of a book in relation to a wall. And so these are all archival inkjet prints in addition to wall painting and floor painting. And I make most, if not all, of my work by manipulating work through Xerox machines and scanners, and then digitally enlarging the pieces that I've created. And I would note that the openness that comes from this work, the unfinishedness that comes from this, has to do with the fact that I intentionally create sentences or non-sentences in the sense of a complete thought on these walls, because I want to see what happens when someone who's following a line and expects for a sentence to be completed by the artist is actually sort of left with the responsibility to complete the sentence themselves. So the openness and the unfinishedness comes from intentionally leaving it open, making an open sentence, making an open text, as Lynn Heijnen speaks about in her essay, The Rejection of Closure. This is from a show called Speech Acts at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philly back in 2017. And this is one of the first times that I was really thinking about what does it mean for a book to sort of explode into space, and what does it mean for the text that may usually be in a straight line in a book to actually take up more space and to actually be spatialized. So thinking about thought being spatialized, thinking about Black poetics and sort of playing with the line and playing with the organization of language, but also thinking about how these different folds and cuts in the wall often focus, have the same features as different elements of a book. So what gets lost in that fold in a book there, what gets lost in the margins, right? And thinking about a page, Douglas Kearney talks a lot about the notion of a page as a stage, and me being really interested in thinking about the exhibition wall as another stage, and how can I think about the structures of a page and where text and information lives in a book, and how can I translate some elements of that into a physical space. And of course, when you're thinking about physical spaces, you're given a lot more space in that you have greater sort of space to play in and greater dimension and different sets of planes. And for this show, I want to note that I returned every several weeks to actually change elements of the installation. So one thing that's really important for me is thinking about part of how art circulates in institutions is that in March you put up a work and you don't return to that work until it's taken down and it's moved to another institution. And so I'm interested in thinking about temporality when it comes to revision and change, particularly for artworks, particularly for my work, which is text and publication based, to say what would it look like to actually change a work while it's being viewed publicly, while people are circulating in the space at the same time. How does that disrupt notions of the thing being a final concrete thought, and sort of shifting our focus to think about what we put out into the world as something that's always in flux, and to be publicly open to watching an artist change an idea or reflect on something or move something around because new information has been integrated into their epistemological understanding of what they're talking about. And these are some more images from this project. And just like previous work, I often will start sentences and not finish them, or intentionally will give the end of a sentence, but not the beginning of a sentence. Again, because I'm super interested in thinking through what it means for someone to go into a work that's intentionally unfinished, with the goal of thinking about whose responsibility it is to engage in knowledge production through a work, and it being a collaborative process. And thinking about those collaborative processes, I wanted to talk about a project called Scoring the Stacks that I did at Brooklyn Public Library in 2019. And this was an opportunity to work with BPL on Grand Army Plaza to sort of think about how people move through the physical space of the library, and what does it mean to think about books as these tactile objects, but how do we get people to engage with text, books, ideas that they wouldn't normally engage with. And so as part of that, there's this large banner that we put up, having abandoned the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. And this was accompanied by these scorecards. And these scorecards were cards that invited people to engage in the library space through this gentle choreography, and through that process to leave behind sort of residue from that experience. So you'll have something like, go to the SST section, find a blue book, read the last page, and write down a word you'd like to use in a future conversation. Folks would write down these words, and then after writing down these words, they would drop them in this large box. And then this large box of just like residue from people who are coming through the library, kids, family members, uncles, aunts, would then be integrated into a series of workshops. So we have 3 workshops where we took all that residue from what people are left behind to do 3 things. One of those things was we work with one of my favorite people, Morgan Bassigus, who is a performer and just all around amazing person, to basically write a song, perform a song, and record a song. Like, we literally in 90 minutes wrote, performed, and recorded a song. And our constraint is that we could only use the words that were left behind. And so in this context, we're thinking about publishing as a process of making something public, and the process of collaborative publishing, the process of collaborative writing, and what that means for authorship. So we ended up with a song that went, forget the future, nobody's more at war. And it's kind of like dark, but there's a moment where we talk about eat the cake, and sort of thinking about our notions of optimism and euphoria and utopia. And this was really fun to think about collaborative writing, and creating these sort of leaky sentences, or sentences that are not completely finished until more people get involved. So thinking about the offering of the folks who went through the scores as offering this to the next stage, people who are constantly sort of adding on or iterating. We also work with Anne Duplan, who's also an amazing writer, to basically write this large poem together, which we also performed through these different constrained writing techniques of writing individually with a large sheet of paper, then shifting from a large sheet of paper to then work in groups, and then working in those groups, and then put together other small fragments of words until we almost did a round robin of these different poems that folks had written. And then finally, we work with a group called Brass Burlesque to think about the words as cues for movements, and created a dance in the trustees' room at the Brooklyn Public Library that thought about the idea of an ephemeral text. So we were creating a text here that only is remembered or sort of held together or grasped by the folks who were present, and even that description has its limitations. Coming out of the Scoring the Stacks experience, this project moved to Philadelphia at Haverford College, and I took on the opportunity to make a very quick book. And by very quick, I meant I gave myself the constraint that I had to create a book using the words collected by participants of Scoring the Stacks. So any words that people left behind, and I had to create the book using only those words, and I only have 36 hours start to finish. And so thinking about constraint-based bookmaking as part of a process of thinking about notions of being finished and not finished, where we know that 36 hours, I'm not done with all of my thoughts, but sort of creating something quickly and leaving space for someone else to sort of pick up where you left off. I'm going to wrap up to talk about a few collaborative writing workshops because they really are helping me think about what role I want to play in sort of like the large publishing ecosystem, and like my interest in thinking about authorship and working with other people. So this is from, I think, August 2019, where I took similar scores from Brooklyn Public Library. And this is at Wendy's Subway, where basically people were sent to look at their phone, text messages, any text in their pockets, receipts, to write out these individual then collaborative statements. And these are some of the things that came out of that process. Start Instagram skirmishes. Oops. We'll read the next one. Bewitched bodies somewhere simultaneously sliding something. Sky reminds their rubbing tongues. The Reverend thrusts his order on the 3 blessed seducers trapped on site in the binary to shop and swim. And so just sort of these beautiful moments of thinking about this text that's co-authored, and this text is sort of created through this process of mining pre-existing text to then write something else. And I think there's something to be said here around, again, these texts always being offered up for revision or commentary or paratext or annotation, and that even though those books are bound and finished on a shelf somewhere, they're still constantly being activated through these scores that are asking people to return to these texts. This is in, where is this at? This is in Peterborough, Canada, earlier, like February 2020, where I was working with a group of folks at the local library there. And we had some performative elements. And then this was one of my favorite pieces that came out of that. They roamed the library looking for these particular things and then had to only use those words to write a story about what the world looks like in 2045. And so what they came up with is that back when Facebook had become a town and George H.W. Bush was scarcely starting from scratch in the oil business, she was a stay-at-home type and not about to lose her children. Surviving together with her sisters, they shared funny stories, feeling secure and stitching social relationships standing forever. And so again, this process of going to mine other texts to then use it as an opportunity to create new text is a sort of openness or aliveness that I'm really interested in. This notion that a text is not dead, it's not frozen, because we're always able to go back and activate it through our, again, interactions with it. This is from Williams College. In the summer of 2019, I did a talk on eschatology, or the study of the end of the world, and they had to look for a set of things throughout the library and then write a story about how the world ends. And one of them here, the succession of life seemed transient. The scholars taught that sacrifice reproduces the topography of sorrow. The scholars blame the British. The setting sun striking Russia demands warfare. 20 families that tradition aside with Ohio, thinking that Roman Senate subjects 2 readers through severe transition. A word I can't pronounce. Undoubtedly the Romans soul reader rolls their souls silent. And then finally, I want to show you guys an example from a project that I did up in Vancouver when I was doing a show at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver when I worked with the girls' school. And we basically did a similar process where they wrote out all these sentences through mining and constrained writing techniques. And then after that process, I took all of their sentences and put them together. And this is what it came out to be. Whoops. I created a team of fictional superheroes over and over again. You're staring into the orange, sure, I guess it can't hurt. A green waterfall defeats the big container. What's below you? Tame it with that game. She is about to give up. This is the last round. When is the right time to say hello? The world is a giant backstory. After this sentence, justice is what I want. And so these are really beautiful experiences for me because I think, again, it reminds me of how texts are constantly being activated and reminding ourselves that things are alive. I wasn't able to get this video up on my slide deck, so I'm going to show it quickly from my computer. Vivian, are you able to see this?
It's just green right now.
Okay, so let me fix that. All right, can you guys see this?
Yes, it starts with bluntly.
Yeah. Yes, so this is from a workshop that I did 2 weeks ago, which was again asking for people to mine text in their home next to them and then type them into the Zoom chat. And then while everyone else was working, I took all the words that were given to me and I had 37 minutes to then write something out of it. So this is a sped up version of that process. And so this was sort of the resulting piece, again, giving us an opportunity to think about activating these, what we might consider to be dead or irrelevant, or sort of these texts that don't have any life left, but thinking about these opportunities of interaction as these moments. And I was really excited about this because I liked, again, the constraint of time and thinking about when we think we're ready to make something public, and this notion that when we make something public, it doesn't actually have to be finished. And our persistence around only sharing complete things means that any risk that we might actually take to think about something being unfinished or thinking about something that receives revision or feedback in its process of becoming, we sort of move ourselves away from that really generative opportunity. I have a few more things to share, and I'm going to hop off. Let me stop this screen, and I'm going to reshare this screen. And I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of something around thinking through collaboration and publishing when sort of like communing or engaging with spiritualism and thinking about Ouija boards. I did a project at the Tiger Strikes asteroid in New York for a short-term residency where I engaged in the process of writing a poem by thinking about where my finger landed on a book and then using where my finger landed on the book to generate a list of about 160 words, which I then used to write something new. And these have taken various forms at this point, from these like large banners to now being these large final poet pieces that'll be out soon, but really interested in thinking about the ways in which things come into being through other things rather than an inspiration or a product idea, but thinking about these things not having a finite or clear beginning and also not having a clear ending. I'll just end here and thinking about what is openness, or what do these poetics of like the unfinished, these politics of unfinished and these pleasures of the unfinished mean when it comes to archiving. Part of what happened in 2018 is I started creating this large collection of Black printed matter during a show at the New Museum in the Lower East Side. And part of this process of collecting all of these publications meant thinking about what does it mean to archive something that's in the process of becoming. And so for the past couple of years, I've been working through this process of like how to catalog this, how to document this stuff, where do the images go, how do you tag this, and thinking about what questions lie ahead of us, because the notion of something being unfinished jives very well with my spirit. But when it comes to cataloging, when it comes to organized materials, when it comes to archiving, what does it mean to have an open or unfinished archive? And what responsibilities, ethical and otherwise, do we have to taking care of these things that are still in the process of being understood and still in the process of becoming? And so this collection now has about 300 pieces that are currently in the process of being scanned in. And it's really important to think about these as part of like a larger tradition of radical Black publishing and the importance of thinking about keeping these things public. And there are some more pieces here. So I'm gonna pause and end here because I think I'm literally at my time of 6:50. I haven't been able to look at the chat, so I'm gonna pause to see if there are any questions or comments. But thank you so much for having me, and it was really great to have the opportunity to talk to you guys a little bit about what I've been thinking about in my practice with publishing and working with text. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kameelah. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions if folks do want to ask. But I just wanted to take a moment to really just think about, I mean, thank you so much. I think throughout the full, 2 days, we heard from this morning from Clara about the book as the body public. So the idea of like the book being alive and the circulation of books in relationship to blood. And then yesterday, Cecilia Vicuna was talking about how the word book comes from the word beech, as in beech tree, and where the runes were written. And then we also heard from Reginald Moore, who is just like an avid reader and actually doesn't mark up any of the books he has. But
I have that restraint.
Yeah, but like actually just like reads the entire thing again to like
Yeah.
to find that one quote or whatever it is. So anyway, those are just the things that were coming up from this weekend. So I just want to thank you so for, for also just bringing all those up and yeah, thinking about that in relationship to the unfinished book.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kameelah. Great, take care.
Thank you. Bye.